Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to the subject of decision making, and in particular, the decisions made by leaders. Now, when we think of leaders, we often imagine lone, inspirational figures lauded for their behaviours, attributes, and personal decisions. But as I explored in the last episode of the show with Wendy Lambourne on legitimate leadership, there's a link to that in the show notes, leaders also have an impact on the way people around them make decisions. My guest on this episode is Professor Don Moore. He's been on the show before talking about confidence. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. And Don has just co-authored a book with Professor Max Bazerman called Decision Leadership, Empowering Others to Make Better Choices, that explores the idea of organizations in the 21st century as decision factories in which effective leaders are decision architects, enabling those around them to make wise ethical choices consistent with their own interests and the organization's highest values. As a result, a leader's impact grows because it ripples out, instead of relying on one individual to play the part of a heroic figure. What Don has co-authored is a fascinating playbook, one, in fact, I wish I'd had when I held leadership positions, that uses behavioral science to help leaders to make more effective decisions. That, obviously, helps to reduce human risk. So please enjoy my discussion with Professor Don Moore on decision leadership. Don, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Listen, it's fantastic to have you back here because last time you were on in the very early days of the podcast, I think it was only a couple of years ago, but could have been centuries ago given COVID, you were talking about confidence. And if there's one thing I'm confident about, is my listeners are going to find what you have to say fascinating.
Let's hope you're not overconfident about that, Christian.
So can you tell us a little bit around the collaboration of the book and what inspired it?
Yeah. So Max Bazerman and I are longtime collaborators, and we have a textbook on judgment and decision-making that's been a fixture in classrooms for years. Judgment and Managerial Decision-Making attempted to take the insights from the burgeoning literature on what was then, at the time of its first writing, behavioral decision-making, and since then has blossomed into behavioral economics, a field that has been influential in all sorts of ways, recognized by Nobel Prizes and attention in the press, and is certainly much more in the public consciousness and in the awareness of businesses and managers for its powerful insights into human psychology and the useful tools that that provides for how to manage organizations better, how to deal better with customers, how to be more effective in what we do. So this book is an acknowledgement of the ripeness of time to take those messages to the world, and in particular to package them in a way that's useful to leaders, people who want to get things done, because understanding both the prescriptive message, how people ought to behave if they were perfectly rational and doing a great job maximizing the welfare of themselves and the organizations and the world of which they're a part. And then also understanding how ordinary people fall short of that wonderful, inspiring ideal.
What I thought was fascinating was that we all have this image that we're given of what leaders should be. And that comes to us through, I guess, growing up, to what we see in the movies, reading books. We're taught sort of strong leadership who are all-knowing, all-wise. And you neatly debunk that and say, well, that's unlikely and it's somewhat unrealistic. And I wondered what you said. Why are we up against that myth? Because if we what I find fascinating, look at sort of characters in movies. They do exist, but actually there is a sort of neat historic set of tales where we can see that wise leaders do take counsel from other people. They don't know everything. And yet there is this pervasive belief, and there are many people in leadership positions that do seem to want to fulfill that the leader has to be omniscient, know everything, and lead from the front.
Yeah. So in the book, we make fun of the great man theory of leadership, which despite its lousy track record and weak evidentiary support, still holds an improbable fixture in the public consciousness and the way that people think about leadership. This idea that somehow great leaders are born that way. And it is by force of personality and by dint of their extraordinary talents, as you describe, that they're destined for greatness and influence. As we say in the book, the great man theory turns out to be as vacuous as it was sexist. It does not provide either an accurate description of what leads someone to become a leader or useful guidance for anyone who wants to be better at leadership. And so we attempt to provide a more useful, accurate, evidence-based picture of what effective leadership looks like. And rather than some sage who commands the masses with the force of his charisma, the image that emerges from our book is much more of leader as midwife, someone whose job it is to help others bring forth the best in themselves, to establish the circumstances that allow people to feel safe, to hear criticism, to listen to the wisdom that they have and use that knowledge to make the best decisions that they can. You mentioned listening to advice, which is a big part of the book. And there are lots of ways in which the most effective leaders are good at listening to others around them, to incorporate that knowledge, not running roughshod with some oversized ego over everyone else, but instead trying to gather the best evidence in a way that humbly reflects their own imperfections and limitations.
You begin the book by talking about Colin Kaepernick, who I mean, it's a great opener because it's an amazing story of somebody really sticking their neck out and I think coming good in the sense of everybody else came around to their position rather than the other way around in the end. And I thought that was interesting. And clearly, I mean, it's clearly deliberately chosen because it makes a very strong point. But I thought it was fascinating because you really start off by talking about someone that one might not necessarily think of as a leader because he wasn't really in charge of anything, hadn't been elected to any position. He was just a very talented, but an athlete that found himself in a leadership position. And so I wondered, with that in mind, how would you define leadership? How do you look at that term?
Yeah. We construe leadership broadly and address our book not only at people who have formal positions of authority, whether that be the quarterback on the football team, that's the sort of player who calls the shots for those of you in the UK, or CEOs of corporations, not only those positions of formal authority, but any of us who have an opportunity to influence the behavior of those around us. And here we're thinking just as much of managing up as managing down some organizational hierarchy. And also your peers in the organization. So one of the powerful lessons that comes out of decades of research in social psychology is about the surprising power of the situation. Most of us intuitively tend to gravitate towards personalities of individuals as explanations for behavior. And the accumulated evidence shows undeniably that the situation plays a massive role in determining how people behave. Even the most gregarious extrovert stands quietly in an elevator with strangers. And even the shyest introvert opens up and chats to others at parties. It's worth recognizing that each of us creates the social situation for those other people around us. We are their situations. And the ways that we behave, the ways that we present ourselves, the ways that we share information, the ways that we invite them to speak up can influence them in powerful ways that either empower or disempower them to make wise decisions.
And as you're talking, there's an obvious, as we record this, there's an obvious real life example. I think there's some fascinating leadership models in play. And so if we look at the most public form, I think of two people that are very different. We've got Zelensky on the one hand, who seems to be a very 21st century leader. I'm not suggesting he ticks all of the boxes, but he's very much more in line with what you're suggesting. And Putin on the other side, who I think clearly is not demonstrating some of those things. I mean, that is a fascinating case study almost for what you're talking about.
Indeed. Yeah. So Putin by dint of his own insecurities and his authoritarian management style, has really distanced himself from the possibility of criticism. I mean, that is one of the great weaknesses of totalitarian regimes like his. And that is that there's really only one brain operating. And despite the misgivings of his advisors and his ministers and his generals, he decided it was time to invade Ukraine. And it seems pretty clear at this point that Putin was not getting the best information about the readiness of the Russian army and the likely resistance they would face when they marched into Ukraine. And those calculations have been colossally costly to him and to his country. As you point out, there are many things to praise about Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine and the ways that he has inspired his nation. It is an inspiring counterexample to what we've seen in Russia.
And of course, I mean, the one thing both of those characters miss is clearly it's not a particular. They're diverse in the sense of their leadership approach and their age, not necessarily in terms of some of the other attributes. And one of the things that comes out loud and clear in the book is clearly that I mean, you've highlighted it yourself. There's a very that male leader, very sexist model, and clearly doesn't benefit from all the things that we know a more diverse approach would lead. And I wonder what your thoughts were on how much we've been held back by that male dominance. And we there haven't really been those. We've had a few exceptions of female leaders, but they very much have been an exception in many cases. Margaret Thatcher being a great example, have adopted many of the attributes that you implicitly challenge in the book. And I wondered, is that something that you would see as opening this sort of dynamic up a bit?
I hope so. Obviously, our society is going through a number of important shifts, and the increase in female representation among managers in large organizations, I think, it is something that, on average, all of us will benefit from. A number of observant scholars in management have talked about the feminization of leadership over the years, that organizations have come to value sort of stereotypically female strengths. The ability to listen to others, the ability to take care for others seriously, to build trust. And when you talk about attributes of successful leaders these days, those sorts of more stereotypically female attributes are certainly more prominent than they were 50 or 100 years ago. And if that means that we do a better job capitalizing on and promoting the talents of capable women, my guess is that there will be benefits. Obviously, to restrict promotion to management to only half the species really limits our ability to tap talent. And I think it would be to the benefit of organizations, society at large, and certainly the women given those opportunities if we do a better job taking advantage of all the human resources at our disposal.
And it struck me that many of the things you talk about, if we look at leaders that don't have some of these attributes, that they're clearly, I'll be polite to say, lacking in some of the skills. Some of that comes from the fact that the processes that have got them there, the attributes that they have had to display on the way, or the systems that they have had to work within, have not encouraged some of these things that you're talking about. So in the same way that perhaps we get the politicians that we vote for, we deserve in that sense, we've also seen leaders, I would argue, in many organizations that are there because the processes that promote leadership, the things that look for, the incentives, if you like, that are put in the part, are precisely the ones that don't necessarily always encourage the sorts of behaviors you're talking about.
Yeah. That is a very wise observation. Organizations that promote people to positions of leadership based on their most grandiose displays of confidence and chest thumping, well, if that winds up promoting the most overconfident, you can bet those organizations are going to get themselves into trouble. How does that happen? Happens too often, and it happens when we pay attention to superficial displays of confidence at the cost of really checking on someone's ability to deliver on those grandiose promises. So one of the pieces of advice we give in the book is to be a little bit more suspicious and to check insofar as you can the individual's ability to match their display of confidence with actual ability. So one way to do that is to think about forecasting and performance, and to keep track and keep score. More and more organizations are getting sophisticated in thinking about how they plan for the future and thinking probabilistically, right? Sometimes we draw comfort from the leader who says, I know what's going to happen. We are going to be fabulously successful no matter what. It's possible also to point to ambitious young leaders who've been a little bit more honest with themselves and their supporters. The young Jeff Bezos, who said, I think there's a 70% chance that this little startup is going to go belly up and I will lose all the money that you invest. I still think it's a good bet because the upside is so big. Turns out he was right about that. But he was also honest about the risks involved. And responsible leaders can be both confident and honest at the same time.
And if I look at, I mean, you name both these individuals, but if I take Trump and closer to home for me, Boris Johnson, there you've got two examples of people who I would argue the substance isn't necessarily there. And what fascinates me about it is you're right to say we should be more challenging around it. And yeah, people vote for this stuff. And people like to buy into that vision. So to a certain extent, I was always struck that we're bringing it upon ourselves because the convenience narrative. So many of the sort of the flaws that you point to in leadership in the book, there is also a flaw to the extent, admittedly, that people have a say in these things, that they are drawn towards that. So followers are, in many respects, have their own flaws that need to be overcome if we want to solve this leadership challenge.
Amen. Yeah. So thinking skeptically about the sorts of claims that leaders make is very helpful. I hear in your question, the indictment, we get the leaders we deserve. And I would like to think that we deserve better. We could argue about whether that's the case, but I think every voter, every corporate board member, everyone who has a voice in selecting a leader could help us achieve a brighter future by thinking skeptically about the risks involved in selecting overconfident leaders. And those risks are huge to all of us. We should want leaders who are appropriately humble, who are honest in their assessment of their weaknesses, who are able to listen to advice and to correct course before they have made some tragic miscalculation. And that might mean sometimes promoting to leadership the one who is willing to confess their weaknesses. That doesn't always play well in the public arena, but it would help us get leaders more deserving of our support.
And I mean, one of the things that if we look at some of the, again, sort of weak leadership is that they tend to double down on the sorts of techniques that you're not encouraging in the book. So let's surround ourselves by people that are even less competent than we are. We don't want any threats in that environment. Let's not open this up to debate or discussion. Let's not expose any weakness. All of that comes together. And so in many respects, if you've got somebody in a leadership position, it struck me that as I was reading these things, I think, well, the things you're proposing, they're the last things those people are going to want to do because it really is exposing the problem. And so many of I guess many of the things that you're proposing would be anathema to those people because it would open them up to even more of a threat. It's quite, unless you are open to these things, it's quite, what you're proposing is in some respects threatening to people who might be inadequate because you're having to admit weakness and having to allow other people's opinions in.
Yeah. I totally acknowledge the challenge that you're articulating. At the same time, it is those attributes that give leaders staying power and increase the effectiveness of their performance as leaders. In the book, we talk about the example of Reed Hastings at Netflix and what he learned from his near-death experience when he tried splitting the company and pissed off so many subscribers who then had to buy a separate subscription to the Quickster DVD delivery service and the Netflix streaming online service. And what he took away from that in the need to listen more to the reservations and criticisms and cautions of his closest allies, and even his critics within the organization.
I'd never heard that story before, actually, because I wasn't a subscriber at the time, but it's absolutely absurd. You're basically, so for people that haven't come across this, it's such a fascinating story. It's literally, you had one subscription, and if you wanted to continue getting DVDs through the mail, you had to take out another one. It was that simple, right? So that, what I find astonishing about that is it's so obviously silly, and that's being polite. And yet he went ahead with it, which is what makes it such a great example.
And the story from inside Netflix is all about Hastings' charisma and the love for him by his colleagues at Netflix. He was a charismatic leader who had widespread support. And it was exactly that support that made it harder for him to hear the criticism. His colleagues saw the passion in him and this fixation with the idea that the future was streaming and Netflix had to separate itself from this old line DVD delivery service, and that was going to be the future. And even though there were plenty of people at Netflix at the time who thought, oh, this might be trouble, they silenced their reservations because of their support for Hastings and the passion that they saw in him. And so what that has produced at Netflix is a culture now where dissent is regarded as not just desirable, but obligatory. If you think that the organization is making a mistake, it is your job to speak up about that and tell the manager who's leading the charge about the concerns that you have. So commit to that dissent. And in fact, the higher up managers are admonished to farm for dissent, actually collecting discrepant viewpoints. And then also, and this is the sort of delicate move for leaders, is once a decision has been made, then pivoting to implementation. And I realize that there's a challenge there that is sort of best encapsulate. My guess is many of your readers or listeners are thinking now at this point, here I am thinking in book mode. They're not going to be reading this podcast. They're thinking about entrepreneurs and the degree to which entrepreneurs have to display outsized confidence in the prospect for their startups. And it is the case that lots of venture capitalists say that they want to see an entrepreneur who's outlandishly confident about their ideas. If that means that the entrepreneur is also making mistakes in the company because they're so sure of their vision, if it means that they've cashed out their investment accounts and maxed out all of their credit cards in order to fund this operation, you have to worry about the degree to which they're well calibrated in their forecasts of future risks.
But I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we can point to lots of people. There are lots of famous examples, as you say, of sort of entrepreneurs that have built things who have arguably potentially been good leaders to start with, right? Who've had that spark and that fire, made things happen that other people might have given up on. But clearly, particularly when those companies go public, there is often a skills deficit because the very things that might have propelled that enthusiasm to start with become wholly unsuited to the sorts of dynamics that apply to public markets. But there is something in having courage of your convictions and driving through and almost barreling through at the start of that process. So I take your point entirely that it becomes unhealthy, but isn't there something in there that says at certain stages this can be really helpful, but I guess but knowing when to stop is quite difficult, and therefore that's when it becomes toxic.
Yeah. So I will readily acknowledge the challenge in doing both. Some companies try to solve that problem by having different people in charge of the different parts. A charismatic out front CEO who inspires the foot soldiers of the organization and charms customers with their brilliant vision. And then there's the sort of cautious, sensible, well-calibrated second in command, or maybe the board of directors that's supposed to exercise parental supervision over the CEO. And it's also easy to identify examples like WeWork, where that totally fell apart. And Adam Newman just took off with his pathologically grandiose vision for WeWork that he managed to fuel by roping in and bamboozling venture capitalists like Masayoshi Son of SoftBank for a while, but he couldn't maintain it forever. Organizations that do better either find a way to rein in some of those more reckless impulses, or have someone at the top who can play those dual roles themselves, who can play the passionate advocate when speaking about the organization's mission, but who can also come back to the office and make carefully and thoughtfully calculated expected value computations that help them make the hard choices every leader has to make.
That model requires a certain degree, and I guess this is implicit in the whole thing, is a degree of self-awareness. So one of the challenges that we know is it's really easy to recognize these sorts of biases and flaws, I guess, for want of a better phrase, in other people. We struggle to see it in ourselves. So implicit in the leadership model you're talking about is a degree of self-awareness, or even if you don't have self-awareness, a recognition that there is a need for calibration.
Yeah. For Max and I, in writing this book, the ethical implications of leaders' choices are just part and parcel of effective leadership. The alternative to imagine that, say, in a corporation, there are business decisions that are wholly separate from moral considerations, is to really just ignore an important part of the calculation for the consequences of organizational choice. Companies face high stakes decisions every day that have implications beyond their walls. Everything from pricing decisions that will price out some consumers to decisions about how much to spend on mitigating pollution, or where to source their energy from, or where to build their factories. These are all choices with ethical implications, and wise leaders will consider these consequences before the press or the courts compel them to do so.
And I thought it was really interesting that you spent as much time in the book as you did on ethical subjects, because that seems to me to be, I think it's always implicitly been there, but we've clearly gone through a period of time where, again, I'll be kind, that's sort of been pushed to the side in many respects in the pursuit, the relentless pursuit of profitability or shareholder value. And so really, what I thought was interesting was that you heard you spent as much time as you did talking about this subject, because it would have been perfectly possible to write the book and just talk about almost just sort of here the list. I mean, you could do it, and there's a very helpful sort of, it's not a checklist per se, but a nice summation at the end that really pulls it all together. But it would have been perfectly possible to write these things. Here's stuff you need to look out for as a leader. Done. But you both decided that ethical piece was really significant.
Yeah. So we orient the book first and foremost toward the guiding star of effective decision-making, choosing the option with the highest expected value, period. That is the essence of good decision-making for individuals. And we talk a lot about how leaders can help others do better at maximizing the expected value of their own choices. Now, in the simplicity and clarity of that advice, there is the very real risk that we wind up focusing in those domains where the calculation is simplest. And that is often the case for financial considerations. Companies can simplify their expected value calculation when they focus just on net cash flow and don't think about the broader consequences that are no less valuable for being hard to compute, right? The lives of the peoples in the communities where the organization resides, the cost in environmental pollution, the risks of future litigation. All these ethical implications are important for any organization to consider. And we included them in the book, both because they deserve such an important place in effective decision-making and because we think it's really important for leaders to keep the ethical consequences of decision-making in mind when they're helping others around them act in their interest, which is to say empowering their own highest ethical values and incorporating those utilities into the decisions that they make.
I was fascinated by the way that you looked at the bias. I mean, you could have written a book that was 10 times as long. And so
it was a temptation, believe me.
I was going to say, and so I'm really interested by the filtering process that went on. I mean, is there a sort of, I don't know, extended version coming out or a second piece? How did you go about that filtering process? Because I thought, as I read it, they all made perfect sense, but I'm pretty sure I'm not sure what the book equivalent of the cutting room floor is, but it seemed to me that there was quite a lot you could have covered, but didn't.
Yeah.
How did that filtering process work, and how did you really identify those key components?
It's a great question. I'll answer in two parts. The first part has to do with our own prior work. So I have another book on confidence. It shrinks to a short chapter in our book. Max has other books on noticing and negotiation. Those are also pieces of the book. We attempt to provide the most useful lessons from that work in what we present. We are also very self-consciously drawing on a larger literature on behavioral decision-making and behavioral economics, while not wanting to be redundant with what else is out there. So the flowering of the field that I referred to at the start of the show has meant that there are a bunch of other great books out there, right? If you want to learn about nudges and the power of defaults, well, reading Thaler and Sunstein's book, it is a great way to go. If you want to understand the biases that afflict human intuition, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a fabulous resource. And rather than repeat what they've said, we try to offer what's unique about these lessons for effective leaders. Some of the stuff on decision biases does sneak into the book in the appendix. We've tried to deliver that in a succinct way that isn't redundant with what else has been offered. But again, our attempt in the book is to package those pieces that we hope will be most useful for people to enhance their performance as leaders and help those around them make more effective decisions.
In other words, there's even if you tick all the boxes in the book, there is still more that you can look at. But you're going, if you get these things done, you've hit the major points in terms of the leadership model that we think is worth pursuing.
Exactly. Yeah. And readers who are curious and who want to learn more, who haven't read those other books, should do more reading. So this is a rich area. Of course, a nerdy academic like me is going to recommend that. But there's lots to learn.
No, but I appreciated that, because I thought very often people try and sort of, well, I'll do a quick summary of X. And actually, it fills quite a lot of space. So people that have already read X don't want to read it again, and people that haven't, it may not necessarily be quite enough. So I very much appreciated that approach. I thought it was a nice nod to it. So if you want to go check that out, that's a better depiction of it. So I thank you for doing that, because from a reader's perspective, that made it certainly for this reader's perspective made it a lot easier. And I'm intrigued by the stories that you picked as well, because we started talking about Kaepernick, we've mentioned Trump and Johnson. As ever with these things, you've picked a sort of rich range of them. And of course, we know that, again, there will be lots of stories left on the cutting room floor. How did you go about selecting what made it in? What were the sort of the criteria for standout stories?
It's a great question. And the stories are hard to pick. So we struggled with them. There were a lot of stories that we researched, lots of leaders who we learned about who didn't make it into the book for one reason or another. Let me just say a few words about the power of stories. What makes books like ours memorable and entertaining is when we can connect our lessons to memorable, dramatic, interesting stories of real people who did real things. But stories are just case studies. One thing that happened to one person. They can be illustrative and memorable and delightful, but they represent very weak evidence. And so in selecting those stories, we were very self-conscious about picking those stories that were consistent with the stronger evidence of broader studies, lab studies with hundreds or thousands of participants that sometimes we describe in the book, but mostly are there as background, relegated to the endnotes where we cite the academic evidence that backs up some claim that we illustrate with a story. So the stories are there to help human minds grasp the lessons that we offer, not presented as evidence. But we've picked stories that we hope will capture the evidence that justifies the advice that we're giving.
I'm always fascinated by sort of progress and innovation clearly comes through trial and error. And one of the things that you highlight is that obviously, in very simple terms, getting other people involved in the decision-making process, so greater diversity of brains on a problem, assuming the views are listened to, is going to help you reduce errors and produce better outcomes. But implicitly, we're also potentially reducing the opportunity for the Reed Hastings type stories and the Kaepernick story, where something goes right. So there's from a storytelling perspective, there's a lovely arc there where it doesn't work out well, but all's well that ends well. But there is something, isn't there, in terms of us failing and being seen to fail that can be very, very powerful. And it's the basis for innovation, so trial and error. And so there was a little bit of me that was struck as sort of saying, isn't there a tension here between we want to encourage the good kind of failure? And therefore, many of the, if I took it to a logical extremity, many of the things you're talking about could arguably stop that from happening. And I wondered where you thought that balance lay.
Wow. Let me first acknowledge the enormous optimism that you have just displayed in the value of the lessons that we provide. If we could find a way to eliminate error and ensure thriving and success everywhere, oh man, would that be awesome? I do not share that rosy forecast of the value of our book's lessons. I do think that implementing them can help leaders reduce their errors. Will they always be successful? There will always, the answer to that is no. I'm shaking my head. There will always be mistakes that happen because our knowledge is imperfect. We can place smart bets on the outcomes of the highest expected values. Even doing so will necessarily produce failures and mistakes and errors. In the book, we wind up advocating the value of experimentation quite explicitly, acknowledging that our knowledge is imperfect, even when you're doing a great job incorporating the wisdom of all those around you and placing your bets as wisely as you can. There is a lot we don't know about what the future holds. And predicting, for instance, the direction that the stock market is taking or the direction of taste and fashion is really, really a hard job. And the reason why is interesting, and we could explore that rabbit hole. But what I should say is that the evidence for the value of experimentation is just overwhelming. So it is too common for organizations to rely on the passionate advocacy of an individual, often a leader, and a compelling story. Here again, the human mind's captivation by a good story, rather than rigorous evidence. And in advocating the value of experimentation, we are encouraging readers to test out their ideas, to subject their guesses, their beliefs, their hypotheses to rigorous disconfirmation by collecting some data that bear on the question. You think you know the customer loyalty program that will maximize the retention of customers you've worked hard to acquire? Well, test it out on some subset of those customers, comparing different ideas with one another. You think you know the website format that will maximize eyeballs on your site and increase sales? Well, test it out relative to other website formats. And in giving this tech example, I am calling out the companies that are doing the best at such experimentation. So Google and Amazon, Apple are experimenting constantly on their websites with the optimal format that will allow their customers to figure out how to do what they want to do, how to find the products they want to find, and to buy those products, smoothing that path in a way that is best supported by the evidence. The companies that don't do that don't experiment enough with website formats, those are companies whose customers have trouble doing business with them. And my guess is that even though the nudge units of the UK government and many state governments in the US have made great progress on some aspects of the ways that governments interact with their citizens, website design isn't at the very top of that list.
Nor's interaction with the tax authorities, they seem to be, that's interesting, isn't it? Because if I look at sort of who has a natural tendency to experiment, well, startups, because they don't have that much to lose, and they're tech companies because they have that natural capability. But yet, if you look in the 21st century, there's an opportunity for all companies have the wherewithal to experiment. So even if you have a tried and tested model, I don't know, you're running a bakery and you've got the recipe that you've been running for millions of years, to exaggerate slightly. You can still, the way you present the product, you can experiment with. The way, what you call it, you can experiment. So every business nowadays has that opportunity. And I think it's fascinating that actually, in many respects, when we talk about the need to do that, it's not a sort of nice to have, and you have a little R&D function that potentially might go. It's like it should be in the core of the business. And so I'm really struck by your comment about governments, because I think you're absolutely right. We do see examples of where they seem to be flexible. But in many cases they're not, and so I'm intrigued to see your thoughts on why that might be. Because when you point it out and sort of say progress lies down the path of experimentation, and yet we seem to have quite a lot of parts of society that could, whether that's businesses or whether that's processes or structures, that could shift and experiment, try things, but are very unwilling to do so. And that clearly, I think, in many respects, comes from many of the biases that you talk about. So I'm intrigued by your thinking around that.
Yeah. So when you describe the bakery that's been doing their scones that way for 1 million years and is reluctant to change, there are lots of organizational processes just subject to inertia. They aren't optimally designed, but they've just always been that way. And sometimes consumers get used to it and will punish the organization for changing its products just because they're used to it, even if the organization, the bakery, can figure out a better way to deliver its goodies. But a lot of aspects of the way that governments operate is just due to bureaucratic inertia. That's the way it's always been. And there are forces within the organization that resist those sorts of changes. At the same time, I will have to acknowledge the great progress that nudge units have made in helping governments. And the UK really led the way in this. That David Halpern at the nudge unit in the UK. So he was a professor of psychology before he was called to Downing Street by David Cameron to lead this office. And Halpern said, if we can't make a tenfold return on the costs of running this office in a couple of years, we'll disband it. And they very quickly found a simple change in the letter that was sent to tax delinquents that, for close to zero cost, brought in tens of millions of pounds in back taxes that otherwise would have been much more costly to collect, and so quickly justified its existence. Other governments have taken note and have begun implementing their own nudge units of one sort or another. Those units obviously face political pressure and resistance from the sorts of organizational inertia that I was describing earlier, but they have done some real good. Everything from increasing the diversity of those who apply to the jobs of police officers. So the city of Los Angeles has done great things there. There are ways in which nudge units are helping government agencies design basic forms to make it easier for citizens to file their taxes or to sign up as organ donors, any number of important things where governments can increase the general welfare by making it easier for citizens to interact with their governments. And corporations have taken note too. So lots more organizations have nudge units of one sort or another, where their people operations or people innovations groups are helping the companies think about ways to get their employees to do things that are in everybody's interest, to be healthier by eating fewer fattening snacks. In the book, we talk about Jessie Wisdom and how she helped design the cafeterias at Google, where Googlers could get as much free food as they wanted, helping them be more intentional about how much dessert they eat, for instance, or helping Googlers make wiser choices about investing for retirement. That design of retirement forms and designs of cafeterias can help people enact their wiser, more thoughtful decision processes.
A lot of that is, you point out that there are a lot of legacy reasons and reasons for friction, stroke, inertia that prevent these things from happening. And one of the things is you were talking, it struck me that when we train people for leadership, so whether that's doing MBA type courses or whether that's sort of in the military, going to leadership academies or government kind of fast track service that send people, often the things that you're talking about haven't necessarily featured that heavily. And so we've got the role model challenge, where if we sort of look at history and we look at some of the people that we've talked about, that's there. But it seems to me some of the things you're talking about, at least based on my experience, I'm conscious that I'm going a few years back before I've done anything along those lines, that seemed to be missing. Is that a fair reflection? Is the things you're talking about groundbreaking, or are we seeing some of those things change in the direction that you're pointing in?
I see some change in a positive direction. Earlier, we talked about the feminization of leadership. And so understanding the human element, the human risk, is becoming more prominent. Behavioral economics in one form or other, behavioral decision research, is more prominently featured in the curricula of leadership training programs. I mean, I know best the training program we provide for our Masters of Business Administration students here at the Haas School at UC Berkeley, where the course that I have taught on leading people occurred at the very beginning of their first year here in the program, and delivered lessons that, unlike some of the other lessons that they get in the MBA program, are most valuable as they advance in positions of authority. So that was a challenge with the class, and why a book like ours, I think, is potentially more valuable. So it was my hope that the lessons I imparted to my students about how to best cultivate the strengths and enhance the decisions of those around them, that those lessons they would remember them and put them into practice once they were in positions of authority, 5-10 years after graduating from the university. Boy, even remembering the stuff for the exam at the end of my class seemed like an achievement. The idea that they're going to think of it 10 years down the line, that seems a little bit grandiose. So at least now I have a book I can offer instead.
But it's interesting there, because you make a really good point. Because if I think back to school, and we're going several decades now, obviously, I do look back, and there are certain things that I was told by teachers that made no sense whatsoever in the moment, but I have somehow retained. And I think, to your point, they were always told there was a story, there was some memorable trigger that's happened. And I kind of listened at the point without even realizing why that mattered. And it's only years later that I've picked that up. So I do think it's not an entirely sort of hopeless cause that some of this stuff might be retained. But I do take the point, it's unlikely that the full contents of your book, even if taught to them, is going to carry through.
Well, I salute the quality of your memory, Christian. Your teachers would be proud.
Well, I may have remembered the wrong things, the stuff that really isn't that important. I didn't doubt it with the significance. But anyway, they'll be pleased to hear it. I'm also interested in a slightly provocative question. Are there any situations in which the attributes that you describe for leaders might be inappropriate? Like where this is the exception that proves the rule, if you like?
What are you thinking of?
I don't know. I sort of thought there may be, and every example I can think of, I then talk myself out of it. But imagine a sort of, emergency situation where we don't have time to consult, right? We just need somebody to tell us what to do because it's that. Yeah. And so I was thinking about these situations and I thought, well, actually, in those situations, you would rely on tried and tested checklists and models for how to deal with those situations precisely because, so we'd almost built structures that dealt with it. So I couldn't think of any, but I just thought it's just worth exploring and saying, are these universally applicable? Or might there be circumstances? And I couldn't find anything, but I just wondered if in your things you'd come across and thought, actually, I would apply this in 99% of circumstances, but actually maybe there's just an example where it wouldn't be sensible.
Okay, so your question gets at something that I think is really important. An erroneous lesson one could draw from our enthusiastic support of wise deliberation and thinking rigorously about calculating expected value, that in criticizing intuition for its flaws and focusing instead on deliberation, you could come away with a lesson that you should always collect more data, right? Analysis paralysis is a real risk in focusing people's attention on deliberation and cautioning them against relying too heavily on gut instincts and intuition. I think that is a misreading of our book because wise decision-making must necessarily include the costs of delay. If dithering has a cost, and usually it does, if only the opportunity cost of what you could be doing if you weren't standing in the grocery store aisle, computing the expected value of every purchase you could make, that's not a good use of time. And so for the vast majority, Max Bazerman, my co-author, has estimated for 95% of the choices that we make every day, relying on fast and frugal heuristics, the sorts of intuitive guides that we've relied on to make those decisions for years, that's often okay because deliberation, delay, and reflection is costly. And if it can only increase the quality of our decision a little bit because the stakes are so darn low, it's not worth it. That the advice that we're giving for the value of deliberation and reflection is most useful for when it matters, when the stakes are high, when you're making an important decision with consequences for yourself, for others, for the larger world. That's when it pays to get serious, to listen to the advice of others, to second guess yourself, and to run an experiment.
And how is it we can recognize that seriousness? And there are obvious things, right? If I buy a house and I go and borrow some, right, that's a big financial commitment. And therefore I will recognize this as having significance. Equally, if I go and buy what I have for lunch today, right, isn't unless I get food poisoning or I choose to buy somewhere incredibly expensive, it's unlikely to have long-term repercussions. And therefore I'm likely to be able to compute that. But how do I go about recognizing when things might have a significance that I wouldn't attribute to it? Because my experience doesn't allow me to do that. How do I think about that?
As you point out, most of the time it's obvious when a decision is a big deal. You're talking about lifetime consequences. You're talking about millions of dollars or pounds. You're talking about something that will have powerful consequences now and in the future. Those are obvious. I think the sneaky ones are the decisions that we make every single day and the policy that we establish for those decisions. In the book, we talk about one of the potential risks in the human tendency towards risk aversion in our choices. So if each day we make the choice not to take some risk, we make the choice not to invest in the stock market today because, well, it's unpredictable, the war in Ukraine, there's so much going on, better to keep my money out. because there's some risk of loss if I put my money in the market. Well, if you decide that way every single day, you never put any money in the market and you never enjoy the benefits of market growth. So it's useful when you have an instance of what is a repeated choice to think about a policy that you might advise someone else. Would I recommend someone always make the choice every day to keep their money under their mattress and not put it in the stock market? No, that seems like a bad policy. That the evidence strongly suggests that our retirement funds will grow in value if we put them in the market, despite the risk of loss on any given day that the market could go down. And if you're checking your account too often, that can feel painful. Well, there's another good policy choice. Don't check your account too often. Put it in an index fund and let it ride.
Love that. I think that's a fabulous bit of advice on which to end. But before I let you go, and I will put links to the book in the show notes. Obviously, it's a fantastic read. It inspired me to think, and actually, I have to say, it's one of those things I had to read a couple of times because I wanted to just process and think about what he was telling me, and also reflect on the times that more often than not that I hadn't done it, and recognize that I wish that I had. So it's so before we close out, I'll get you to remind people what the book is called. What's next on your agenda, having done this?
Wow. Next on my agenda is to put the book's lessons into practice. I find myself in the role of associate dean here at the Haas School of Business, and am prompted to regularly think of the sort of pessimistic adage, those who can do, those who cannot teach. I've been teaching for an awfully long time, and now I'm facing the challenge of doing. It is an inspiring and delightful challenge that I'll be working on for the coming years.
That's beautiful because you've basically equipped people who want to challenge you with the perfect tool to do so. So I'd love to see that being, hopefully it won't be used against you too much, but I think valuable if it is. So before we go, Don, please remind people what the book is called.
Decision Leadership, published by Yale University Press, available at fine booksellers everywhere.
Fabulous stuff. I will put links to that in the show notes. But once again, for the second time, thank you so much for writing a fabulous book and also being a great guest on the podcast.
Many thanks, Christian. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Don for appearing on the show and to you for listening. To find out more about decision leadership and to hear the previous episodes on leadership and the one that Don appeared in on confidence, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do. It really does help. To find out more about Human Risk, the work that I do with my clients, and to subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.